Good morning. Welcome to the storage bid cost recovery, BCR, and default energy bid, DEB enhancements. My name is Brenda Marquez. On behalf of the stakeholder affairs, we welcome you to our meeting. Today, we'll be covering a few housekeeping slides as this call is being recorded for informational and conveniences purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Also note that we encourage comments, but please maintain comments to be brief. As well, don't repeat any comments that were previously made in order for us to cover our topics and move along with our agenda. If you do experience any technical issues during the call, feel free to submit a chat question to our event producer or myself and we'll help you. We also will be monitoring raise hands during the call. During the raise hand call, you're able to select the raise hand located on the bottom of your toolbar by the chat window. Here we'll have you added to the queue. We also encourage if you do raise your hand, please lower your hand once you're done so that way our speaker is able to know who has a question. We also may use the audio only *3 to dial into the phone line. And I do see a few folks that are joining through the mobile application. So make sure you're on, you double mute, if you're double muted to unmute yourself as well, because that does happen. So for all folks, please make sure you state your full name and affiliation. Before stating a comment, we definitely want to know what organization you're coming from so we can properly address any questions to what you're saying. And then also just submit a question to us through panelists and we'll be monitoring those as well. And let us know if you'd like us to announce those questions during the chat to be for just the panelists or for everyone to hear. We also will help, we'll check on the attendees on the chat window if they're able to chat, but at this time, we'll please submit them through the panelists only. For today's agenda, I'll go over one slide on the CAISO process, stakeholder process, and then I'll introduce Sergio Dueñas, our storage sector manager for this project, as well for the California ISO. He'll be covering the draft final proposal that we posted a few weeks ago, and also review about issues in regarding mitigation and an open discussion. We are aware of many questions will be asked during the call, so reminder, just make sure you raise your hand and also remain from repeating any questions previously made so we can definitely address all the questions in the queue. But at this time, we'll go ahead and do one more slide and then I'll pass it to Sergio. This is just an overview of the proposal development phase of where we are at. So right now we have posted that draft final proposal on October 4th. We also have this meeting today to discuss that, and we plan to also provide that common template today, hopefully for the October 21st deadline of the comments being due. We will also have Sergio cover a few aspects of the draft final proposal for folks to see where we're at, and also the comments that will be opening up for this discussion and submitted. So at this time, let's go ahead, pass presentation rates, and Sergio, you can go ahead and move slides and hopefully go do a quick audio check just to make sure we can hear you.
Everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I think I was double muted. Cool, thank you. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our call today to talk about the draft final proposal, the examples contained therein, and some of the analysis and topics regarding mitigation as well. So first, I'll start with a bit of background. As you all know, we've been discussing throughout this initiative the fact that the BCR construct today does not adequately consider state of charge for storage resources, and state of charge is essential for these resources to support their energy, their awards and their schedules, right? So the current rules for BCR have resulted in materially different treatment between conventional assets and storage resources, and overall they have created two concerns that we've been naming Concern 1 and Concern 2. Concern 1 is that storage assets are not exposed to real-time prices for deviating from their day-ahead schedules. So essentially, they are, insulated from that risk, and as such, they don't have a clear incentive to um, to not deviate from their day-ahead schedules and to meet them. Concern number two is one that we've been more familiar with from this process, and it is that storage assets may have an incentive to bid strategically to maximize their combined VCR and market payment, meaning that under certain conditions, storage resources might bid in a manner that would unduly inflate the VCR that they will receive. So through this process, we have, I think, as a community, agreed that the issues regarding VCR are definitely complex and require significant analysis and time. So there's been a bit of a consensus that a redesign of storage uplift is necessary. But in the near term, the ISO has decided to focus this present effort on closing the concern related to strategic bidding, concern two. The near-term solution that we discussed in the draft final proposal would be an interim solution that is based on the recommendations from the stakeholders, so that we use a modified cost proxy in the VCR calculations, essentially moving away from only using the real-time bid as that proxy, and instead building upon the latest CISA proposal of applying a modified cost proxy that looks at the real-time bid, the day-ahead LMP, the DEB in its different components, and including that in the VCR calculation. So through the discussion today, we'll be referencing this modified VCR calculation. These are the formulas that we're talking about. When you hear that, this is what we're alluding to. In this same context of thinking about how to modify the VCR as it applies to storage resources, we've heard concerns from stakeholders regarding the need for a specific exemption or a specific type of settlement for instances of market power mitigation. There's been a couple of analyses that DMM presented, and one as well from the ISO that we've included in the draft final proposal, that have found that the impact of mitigation on incremental dispatch is generally small, both historically and on their counterfactual scenarios where resources bid at $1,000 per megawatt hour in the hours preceding the net peak. From those analyses, the ISO holds that these concerns related to mitigation are important for the discussion of a broader redesign of uplift, but they should not delay or complicate the implementation of a near-term solution focused on closing the gap related to strategic bidding. And we'll cover those analyses in more detail later in the presentation. So that is all for the background. I think that, we're all familiar kind of with what I just shared. In the interest of time, it would be ideal to start moving towards the discussion of the draft final proposal, but I'll pause here in case there's any questions so far. I don't see any hands raised.
There's no questions in chat also. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Let's keep going then. And I'll be pausing every now and then in the next slides when I see hands up or if I think that there might be some reactions. So please bear that in mind that, there'll be some opportunities for it. Okay, so the road to the draft final proposal really starts with our last round of comments that were submitted September 23rd, a couple weeks ago. In these comments, CISA offered some modifications to the trigger conditions of its alternative solution. In prior comments and in prior discussions, the ISO and stakeholders had underscored that there were complexities that were material when relying on the state of charge of an asset as the trigger to either use a modified version of the BCR calculation or to make energy associated with given intervals ineligible for BCR. Overall, relying on the SOC is definitely complex, particularly because, we're not just thinking about or looking at what is happening in a given interval necessarily. The influence of advisory intervals is material, and as such, just using the SOC could be very, very difficult to first to correctly address or identify the intervals and energy where a modified calculation or ineligibility would be applicable, but also to operationalize and implement. So the triggers that CISA put forth is avoid those complexities by focusing on the characteristics of a given interval. As you can see here, these are kind of mirror images of each other for the buyback and sellback of discharge and charge schedules. Three triggers are that there should be a day ahead or base schedule, either to discharge or charge, that the real-time dispatch is lower than that of the day ahead or base schedule in either the discharge or charge direction, and that in real time that dispatch is not flipping the resource to do the opposite as the day ahead or base schedule would have indicated. In the case of a buyback, that it wouldn't flip to charge the resource. In the case of a sellback, that it wouldn't flip to discharge the resource. In those comments as well, CISA offered modifications to the proxy energy costs that would be considered within the alternative solution. Before, there's been a couple variations, iterations of this notion. First, we started talking about changing the real-time bid to the day-ahead LMP. That then became, let's say, the first version of a min-max function applied for the buyback and sellback conditions. And this latest iteration is a bit more complex min-max function that from CISA's comments, it seeks to ensure that if the real-time bid would have resulted in a surplus, that surplus is maintained, but that if the real-time bid would have resulted in a shortfall, that other cost proxies could be used so as to minimize or in some cases eliminate that shortfall. Essentially, the goal of these calculations is not to affect surpluses while eliminating the chance for bids to unduly inflate shortfalls. What we've seen from the comments in that period, in the 23rd, we saw that several stakeholders did offer support for this latest iteration in one form or another. Particularly, Vistra, WPTF submitted comments that broadly echoed the position shared by CISA and its modifications. And they included perhaps some differences in the triggers, but they all agreed on the notion that that min-max formula could be utilized and that it should be used only in the intervals that meet certain triggers. PG&E submitted comments that were a bit similar. Their version of the modified calculation had small difference, as it's underscored in the draft final proposal. And in their comments, PG&E also noted that they would be open to have these modified calculations apply across all intervals, provided that the ISO can share additional information on how it can integrate that logic for intervals with not know day ahead schedules. In the, there's also, another, let's say, group of stakeholders that continue to oppose proposals that seek to only modify the way in which VCR is calculated. Particularly, I'd say, Cal advocates noted that they would oppose the use of a modified VCR calculation as it focuses on alleviating only one of the two concerns that have been highlighted through this process. Instead, Cal Advocates has recommended adopting what DMM shared as a viable near-term option earlier in this process, which would be the elimination of most real-time VCR payments. For this, Cal Advocates suggest that there should be a sunset provision so as to incent the development of a redesigned uplift mechanism for storage. In their comments, however, they did underscore that if the ISO moves forward with a modified VCR calculations to resolve the concerns related to strategic bidding, that the real-time bid parameter should be removed from the modified bid formula, and that the formula should be applied to all intervals, that the DEV should not be used as it does not represent hourly storage opportunity costs and may misrepresent opportunity costs leading up to peak demand hours, and that the ISO should apply the minimum or maximum state of charge trigger condition at the start of the binding interval. Overall, I'd say that this position is, not unique in the sense of that it's informed by the fact that the current effort or a modification of the VCR calculation would not address concern one, it would solely address concern two. And, we are aware of the need to continue discussing uplift in a manner that can mitigate and resolve both of those concerns. Similarly, the DMM also expressed that none of the alternative proposals that stakeholders have put forward would address the real-time bidding incentives that are created by the current VCR design, which overall lead to inefficient dispatch. And the DMM also, urged the ISO not to rush to implement interim measures that only address concern number two or other limited scenarios created by the actions of scheduling coordinators. Instead, urging us to move forward on the let's say, refined version that of the notion, the idea, the proposed solution that we included in our issue paper and straw proposal a couple months ago. Between these two groups of stakeholders, I'd like to, note that there's also some that have noted that a modified version of CESA's proposal could serve as a middle ground alternative. In particular, SEE in their comments noted that while some market participants are pretty strongly against applying these modified calculations across all hours, this could be, a viable compromise that would incent market participants to bid accordingly. This is, potentially a viable compromise given that the status quo could result in excess VCR, whereas completely removing real-time VCR could result in an overly punitive outcome as well. So in this context, using a modified formula across all hours could strike an implementable and reasonable balance that also allows us to circumvent some of the complications that we've talked about related to MIO and the fact that advisory intervals have a significant impact on the solutions and outcomes on binding intervals as well. So this should give everyone on the call a bit of a comprehensive overview of where the proposals are at right now, where stakeholders are at right now as well. And based on this, we'll discuss a bit more what we found through some analysis and why we think the draft final proposal is a reasonable approach in the near term to address concern number 2 that builds upon what we've discussed throughout this process. I'm not seeing any hands or anything, so I'll keep going. But please, if you do have any questions or anything, raise your hand and we'll take a pause when needed. So, CISA's latest proposal, the latest iteration of these min-max formulas, is an improvement upon the current VCR calculation because it considers and recognizes that the real-time bid might not be the sole or best proxy of cost in this context, but from the ISO's perspective, it must be applied across all intervals to actually eliminate the opportunity for strategic bidding to inflate VCR payments. The trigger conditions that we've seen put forth by stakeholders, they do not recognize that the bulk of the VCR that is being paid to this asset that are uneconomically dispatched as part of SOC constraints that could be binding in either the binding interval or any of the advisory intervals. And this is because the triggers, they focus on the conditions of a specific interval, but they do not have a consideration of advisory intervals. This is similar really to the challenge that we shared before surrounding the ISO's proposed solution that was included in the issue paper and straw proposal. The fact is that because of how multi-interval optimization works, particularly for a resource that is energy limited, like storage, the conditions that influence the decisions in the binding interval are not limited to that binding interval. They are influenced as well for what is going on in the advisory intervals. As such, uneconomic dispatch can happen in the binding interval regardless of whether in that specific binding interval the resource is at its SOC constraints. This could be the result also of what is going on in the advisory intervals, either that the SOC will constrain later on, or that there are schedules awards later on, as well as if different other prices are potentially materializing as well. So therefore, applying the modified calculations across all intervals would result in a more equal treatment, because today the ISO does not make whole other asset classes when they are unable to perform due to fuel limitations. And I see a hand is up, but I'll pause in a couple of slides so that we can cover a couple of the points here. We also, I think we're in agreement through this process, as we've been discussing modified calculations, that modifying the VCR calculation to use other variables as the cost proxy is reasonable. And this is, very much related to some of the findings that were related to the ASSOC constraint previously in a couple of years back. Through this process, both stakeholders and the ISO have indicated that the energy bids from storage resources are used for other purposes than simply to reflect marginal costs, either to ensure compliance with schedules, to be able to manage state of charge, and to convey opportunity costs, etc. FERC has found that the bids submitted by energy storage resources do not solely reflect those marginal costs. And as such, using different cost proxies does not make any energy or any interval ineligible for BCR. It merely changes the cost proxy that is used to calculate those BCR surpluses and shortfalls so as to eliminate the opportunity for an asset to bid strategically and unduly inflate BCR payments. There is, precedent both in our market and in prior processes that different cost proxies could be used for the purposes of BCR, and particularly for storage assets. I think that there is, sufficient understanding in the community, in the ISO and at FERC, that the real-time bids, the bids in general, are not a pure reflection of marginal costs, and other cost proxies could very well be used for the purposes of uplift. So in this context, applying a modified BCR calculation across all intervals to eliminate the opportunity to bid strategically to inflate BCR payments ensures that resources, storage resources, are made whole to a reasonable proxy as an interim solution. We've seen that in the latest round of comments that some parties would not oppose this application of the BCR calculations, the modified BCR calculations across all intervals. And because of that, but they did request additional details on it. So we prepared several examples, and we'll talk about them. Before going there, I'll pause here to address the couple of hands that are up. Yeah.
Let's go to Don first from CISA.
Don Trethway from CISA. Are you able to hear me? Because I've been having intermittent issues hearing Sergio, so just want to confirm.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So first question, and thanks for the presentation. When you say apply it in all intervals, are you saying all intervals in the day or all intervals when there's a day ahead schedule?
Yes, that is a good question. So we are saying all intervals in the day, and let me add a little bit of color here. In discussing internally following the posting of the paper last Friday, we noted that there could be a bit more clarity on that in the paper. The sentence that explicitly states that in section 7 could be enhanced or be more clear. So we'll actually post an update to that today, because so that it explicitly states this, and it explicitly notes that it will be in all intervals of the day with reference to like how we are including that. So that way, both all stakeholders will be able to submit specific comments on that language, since we realized it was a little bit unclear. So we want to add that clarification, and we'll post that later today, Don. Yeah. If you're talking, you might be muted, Don. I don't know.
No, you disappeared from me. So I do think applying it in all intervals is overly punitive. So let's say that I don't have any day ahead schedules, no day ahead schedules the entire day. I'm not self-scheduling in real time. And in the multi-interval optimization in real time, the CAISO's forecast is shows that it's appropriate over the horizon for you to dispatch me out of merit in the binding interval, because in the future advisory interval, I can cover the prices cover the spread between my charge and discharge bid. And if the CAISO is 100% correct, then the shortfall in my binding interval will be offset by the surplus when the advisory interval becomes binding. And so there's no BCR. But if the CAISO is wrong with its forecast and that advisory price does not materialize, that's an appropriate reason to give a storage resource BCR, because they forego or incurred cost in the binding interval, but it didn't get offset with the revenues because the CAISO's forecast was wrong or changed. So I think that not providing BCR when you make basically a dispatch decision based on the advisory information, to me, is very similar to making a commitment decision, but then realizing that you actually didn't need it later on and you need to pay the resource BCR. And so I think in that sense, this is actually taking a far more punitive approach to, participation in the real-time market than the original intent of this entire initiative was, which is to address when you have a day ahead schedule and there's the ability to inflate BCR because of the buybacks or sellbacks.
Yes, thank you for the comment, Don. I would say that, well, two things. First, I'd say that the goal of the initiative overall definitely has evolved, and I would say that it has become more targeted on concern number 2. However, we are, still acutely aware of concern number 1, which is the fact that the current BCR paradigm insulates storage resources from the risk of deviating from their day ahead schedules, the risk of non-performance in that regard. So that continues to be part of the thinking, the rationale here. Now, specifically to where we're moving towards with the draft final proposal, I would disagree a little bit with the characterization that a scenario like the one you described would result in not having BCR. As stated in the slide I'm showing now, this proposal would not make any energy or interval ineligible for BCR. There will be a shortfall calculated. It would be calculated to the cost proxy that we have agreed upon through using this modified calculation. And therefore, what the solution, what the draft final proposal is putting forth is merely changing the cost proxy that is used to calculate this BCR surpluses and shortfalls. If a shortfall is to be calculated, then that shortfall is likely to be, either modified or minimized by virtue of the formula that was shared. Surpluses would remain intact, but we're not making any energy or any interval ineligible for BCR with this proposal.
Sergio, the problem is in the scenario I just raised, where the resource, based on its bids, is held out of merit in the binding interval to meet an advisory interval, and then the advisory interval does not materialize as the CAISO forecasted, the correct cost to use is the real-time bid. It's not to use a proxy for it.
Well, we appreciate the comment. The way we're viewing this is that the defining what the correct cost to utilize is definitely part of the issue with what bids actually convey. Are these bids just a measure of marginal costs or not is part of the question. And as we've stated prior, and FERC has found, these bids are not purely a representation of marginal cost. In this context, we're not disallowing that. We're not making ineligible any interval or energy. We're simply modifying the cost proxy that is being utilized here. I appreciate your comment and your perspective, and we'll love to see that also in your written comments to be able to assess that and incorporate it into our thinking. Yeah. Okay,
Callie
I'm not
Wells.
hearing. Okay,
Oh,
yes.
sorry. I think Dawn muted. Callie Wells, go ahead.
Hi, Sergio. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. I actually had a question along the same lines. I first wanted to follow up on the conversation you just had with Dawn. So I agree. I think I appreciate the clarification you just provided verbally. So this is going to be applied. You're essentially changing the real-time BCR calculation for storage resources 24/7. Am I understanding that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yes. That's what we mean with all intervals. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, when we originally started this stakeholder process and it got to the point which we appreciate, like Kaisa agreed, okay, let's first focus on an interim solution so we can take the time to holistically review and look at how BCR should be applied for storage resources. This seems to be a little bit of a scope creep in my mind, taking it from an interim solution, which I thought we were all working towards to be applied in, identified situations, to now we're going to change how real-time BCR is calculated for storage resources 24/7. That to me seems more like a conversation that we should be having more holistically in what I would hope to be phase 2 of this conversation. Because now I'm sitting here going, okay, how are we going to justify this, that storage resources should receive completely different BCR treatment than any other resource in the CAISO market in all situations? I think we can agree there are some nuances with storage resources, and originally that's why we had been working on the triggers. You guys initially proposed triggers, but now it seems like that's getting thrown out the window, and we're sitting here having to justify why real-time BCR for storage resources should be completely different than any other resource. And I guess I'm not quite there yet, and I was hoping that was a conversation that would take place in track 2 or phase 2 of this effort, and we would just focus in on certain intervals that met certain conditions. I just wanted to kind of, I agree with Don's perspective on this. So just to kind of verbalize that here, but I guess my original question I had before the clarification you provided was—
Could I address that quickly, Kelly, before you go with your question, though? Well, I would say, and I'll have to go all the way back to the first kind of background slide, which we have visited and revisited this slide almost every stakeholder meeting since we started. The justification for why storage resources should have a different BCR approach is the fact that today, the current rules result in a materially different treatment between storage and other resources. Today, storage resources are not exposed to real-time conditions and prices for deviating from day-ahead schedules, essentially for non-performance, and they do receive BCR for running out of their equivalent of fuel, their state of charge. So the differentiated treatment exists today. The modification is to try to bring those resources in alignment to what we do for other assets, so that there is, a comparable application of BCR. What is the justification further? Just one moment. What is the justification further for modifying the cost proxy? Well, the fact that bids for any other resource are generally an expression of marginal cost, but for storage, they are not. for storage, their bids are more than just their marginal costs. And perhaps even more fundamentally, I'd say, storage is essentially different to other resources because it's bidirectional, because its fuel risks are endogenous to the market it participates in, and because it will always be energy limited. And in that regard, given its responsiveness too, it will always be more responsive, more affected by the conditions in not just the binding, but also the advisory intervals. So, I would not state that the discussions that we've been having here, what has changed is our understanding on the feasibility of a proxy of triggers for the SOC since we started with the issue paper and straw proposal. But our notion that BCR rules as they apply today result in a differentiated treatment, I think that remains. And that's why we need to address this. But go on, yes.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So you said a couple things that I just want to kind of respond to. So first you said storage resources when they're running out of their equivalent fuel. And I think we agree with that. And that's why we were originally looking at cases where the SOC didn't support their day-ahead schedule, because for storage resources, you're right, that is when they are running out of their equivalent fuel. But that's not always the case. And in those other cases where they actually have sufficient state of charge, as Don was pointing to, there's other conditions where the market is making decisions that's out of their control, and actually thermal resources and other resource types also have similar situations that still provide them BCR, that you're not changing their formulation. So just to respond quickly to that one. And the other one, this has been, I think, repeated throughout the stakeholder process where storage resources bids aren't just marginal costs, but FERC has opined opportunity costs are valid marginal costs to represent in the market. So I guess we'll just kind of have to agree to disagree on those couple points, but I don't want to take up more airtime. I did have my original question, which is along the same lines. In our comments, we had asked for some clarification on what other conditions in the advisory intervals. Let me back up for a second. So earlier you had mentioned that there are other types of schedules in the advisory intervals that might result in the resource being dispatched uneconomically in the binding interval. And we had in our comments laid out all the different types of schedules that we could think of that would result in that. So your self-schedules, your end-of-hour state of charge. And as far as we're aware, all of those are already addressed through modified BCR treatment. So are there other types of schedules that we're missing?
Yeah, I would say that there's several conditions that are already addressed with the current provisions. For example, like the end-of-hour state of charge or some outages. But the key one is perhaps that the state of charge would be binding within the advisory intervals as well. That is a key scenario that is not captured either in our initial proposed solution in the issue paper and straw proposal, nor in the trigger conditions put forth by stakeholders as well. So I'd say that is perhaps the key gap in that context. We did include in the draft final proposal discussion on some of the elements that Vistra raised, that there's significant overlap there between those Vistra comments and the WPTF comments. So that part also, relates and speaks to that. If there are, additional questions or clarifications, we'd love to see that in your written feedback as well, so that we can consider that and incorporate it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess maybe our comments weren't very clear, and so I apologize for that. But so the reason why an SSC will be binding in advisory intervals, there's lots of reasons, there's lots of different drivers. We laid out several of them, right? Your end of hour state of charge, maybe you have a self-schedule in the advisory intervals, maybe you actually have a self-schedule outside, but the market adjusts for that. And those agree, those can all cause the state of charge to be binding in advisory intervals. Those are all already handled by modified BCR rules. Aside from market elements that are out of control of the market participants, like the advisory prices Dawn was talking to, flexible ramping product, those agree can also cause state of charge to be binding in advisory intervals, but those warrant BCR treatment. So I was curious if we are missing any other drivers, because when we started kind of going down that path, it occurred to us that I think the concern you guys laid out with advisory intervals might not be that big of a concern. So we were trying to understand your position. Is it because you think there's a lot of drivers in those advisory intervals, or is it more of an implementation issue? Because knowing that, I think will help narrow in on some of these triggers. But I didn't mean to take up all this airtime. I will let others speak, but I did want to, maybe we can talk offline and seek more clarification on that, because I do think most of those conditions are already handled by BCR rules that have been modified.
Yes, I appreciate your comment, Callie. I would just restate once more that we agree and understand that those conditions warrant BCR treatment, as you said. That's why we're not eliminating BCR. That's why we are not making BCR energy or intervals ineligible to BCR. BCR will continue to be calculated and paid out. The difference here is the cost proxy. The cost proxy will no longer be the real-time bid.
Yeah, which goes back to which goes back to the original point that I think Dawn was making, and I was kind of following up on, was, so if you agree those are all warranted BCR, then why are they a different formula or a different approach than any other resource type?
Because market participants could bid to inflate it, and that exposes ratepayers. That is the justification in part. The other is because their bids are not the pure representation of marginal costs. And even if opportunity costs are, part of it too, there's other elements of why resources bid like they bid. We've heard in this conversation, conversations, that market participants often use their bids in a manner to, let's say, quote unquote, firm up schedules. That is not a representation of cost either. That is a way to utilize how they understand the market software works to ensure a given outcome. I'm not saying that is, that shouldn't have been done before, but now that we've identified that bids can be used strategically to inflate BCR, that is part of why we don't want to use the bid. The second part is because both us and FERC has found that real-time bids for these resources are not just about marginal costs. So I would really advise that we move away from the language of this still warrants VCR. We agree. That's why we're not eliminating it. We're merely changing the cost proxy that is being used to calculate. And I would also add, just by going at the formulas, that the formula that we're using does not eliminate the possibility of the bid being the one that is used to calculate the VCR, right? The way that this is written, under many conditions, it is the real-time bid that will be the cost proxy for that VCR. So what we're doing is we're making sure that it cannot be manipulated or strategically used, but it is still part of the formula. The BCR will continue to be calculated and paid as well, but now we have other cost proxies as well.
Okay, I appreciate it. I just encourage you guys to go back and maybe revisit which intervals it's applied to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sergio, we do have one more question if you'd like to go over that one really quick.
Yes, please.
Alva from PG Andy, let's go ahead and unmute you. Thank you.
Hi, Sergio. I'm not sure this is the right point to address it, but could you go back to the formula? I wanted to point out a different issue that I think is not difficult to address, but it kind of needs to be addressed for this to work in the way that you're talking about it in terms of the calculation of the proxy. I think the one problem I have with this formula at this point applied to all intervals is why the DA LMP should be applied in intervals when a battery is not dispatched day ahead. And I think the way you could deal with that based on your paper is to treat those intervals for internal batteries as you would treat WEIM batteries. In other words, that you would simply null that term in the formula in that case. So I wanted to suggest that as something that in my mind would make the formula more reasonable, because I think otherwise there's some weird gaming effects that could happen because of knowing the DA-LMP going into the real-time market. So that's the one comment I have. I think you've laid out the case well in my mind, and glad to see the clarity with which you presented all of the different positions on this. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Alva, and that's a great recommendation that we'll keep in mind. And yes, we'll think about that, and we'll also would love to see it in your written comments as well. Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
We have another question. You're unmuted.
Thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vista. Can you hear me, Sergio?
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks so much for the presentation so far and the open dialogue with Don and Callie. I really appreciate that. No, I'm jumping in to support Alva. I appreciate Alva from PG&E bringing up that question. In Vistra's written comments, I'm 99% certain we clarified that if there was no day ahead schedule, that this formula would have a null, so not a zero, but a null. And I had assumed that would apply whether it was a WEIM or a resource that participated in day ahead. So in case that was an assumption and I did that fatal flaw when you assume, I wanted to further echo that was our intent in our comment.
Great. Okay. No, thank you for that feedback, Kathleen. This is something that we've also been thinking internally, so I'm glad that this conversation came up because we can work on that and make it work. Yeah.
That sounds great. And one other follow-up question. Thank you so much. And one other follow-up question, because some of that back and forth, I know when you were earlier presenting today, you emphasized that the proposal you're talking through is interim. I heard a little bit of, is it interim, is it not interim? And I just wanted to ask you to re-clarify, because I'm receiving this proposal in a very specific context, which is that it is interim and that we are moving on fairly quickly, and perhaps you can provide insight to that, or if you're going to discuss it, parking lot it, to developing a more durable uplift framework for storage. So you're asking us to see this from an interim perspective. Is that correct? Can you please clarify that? It's my last question. Thank you.
Yes, I would say two things. First, we definitely want to move ahead with this solution to close the gap related to strategic bidding as soon as possible. That being said, we also want to move quickly to rethink uplift for storage, because we understand, we appreciate that for some stakeholders, this is doing too much. For other stakeholders, this might not be doing enough. And in the middle is the potential impact of reliability of what we have today. So we obviously want to move ahead quickly with the conversation of rethinking uplift so that we, have a durable approach for storage. In that context, this modified formula, should be understood as an interim approach. It does improve upon what we have today. It does improve upon the formulation that we use today. And if through the discussions that we have on the durable, uplift mechanism, we decide to keep elements of this or tweak them and evolve them, that is viable. But this is not the end state. We'll definitely keep, developing and rethinking uplift, and we want to start those discussions really right away. Ideally, have at least the first conversation or a couple of conversations prior to the holidays, and that is, part of our stated goal. Does this help, Kathleen?
Yes, it does. Sorry, double muted. That does help, Sergio. Thank you. And I think just the more clarity that you can give about kind of timeline for the next track will be helpful for the stakeholder community. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
There are no additional questions as of right now.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So let's keep going to look at some examples. Sorry. Yes, this is the slide I left off. So stakeholders asked us to develop and show a little bit more how we'll apply the effects of applying this across all intervals and how we'll do that. As I mentioned before, we noted that some additional clarity on that would be useful for you all to digest the draft final proposal and submit your comments as well. So we'll add that clarification and repost that paper later today. But all of the examples that we shared in the paper are the ones that are included here. And as I mentioned, what we've done is include, look at the CISA proposed triggers and compare the status quo to modified calculations only under intervals that meet those triggers, and then using the modified calculations across all intervals. These examples are simplified, but they are based on dispatch that we've observed, although they do not represent any actual settlement outcomes for any existing resources. So, they're based on what we've seen, but they're not, they're still simplified scenarios and examples. Because our focus on this initiative right now is to close the design gaps related to strategic bidding, these examples are constructed so that in a way where these resources may bid strategically to capture unduly high BCR payments. So what that means really is that the status quo value that you'll see in these examples includes some of that potential strategic bidding, and we are using that so as to be able to discern what will be the potential impact of these different proposals and approaches that have been put forth. So I know this is kind of small, but I wanted to give you a slide that basically contains, let's say, the legend which you would use to read a map. This tells you really everything that we are trying to do in all of the different examples, different approaches. It's all color-coded with the same colors for the bars, as you'll see in the next graphs. And it basically shows you that we have the status quo in yellow, Then the more like pastel colors are used for the different methodologies, but across all intervals. And the colors that are a little bit darker are the same methodologies, but only for the subset of intervals that meet the criteria or triggers put forth by CISA. There are, descriptions, clear descriptions here of what each scenario entails, what each approach entails, and two methodological notes that I think are important. The first one is that for all of the approaches that use a form of min-max calculation, those are applied both in the 15 and 5-minute market, and the checks for the triggers put forth by CISA are only applied in the 15-minute market for simplicity. This is important because storage, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar by just looking at the data from your units, but storage, contrary to like a conventional unit, it is likely to have different outcomes between, day ahead, 15-minute, and 5-minute. So the fact that we're applying these triggers of the 15-minute would generally ease the categorization of what type of interval is each of them. Is it a buyback or a sellback interval? So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the frequency of the intervals that meet all of the CISA trigger conditions for each of the example units. This is important to highlight because I think that this shows that it is relatively complex for a given interval to meet all of these three conditions. In particular, the third condition, that is that the asset should not flip from, charge to discharge or vice versa. The fact that all of these triggers are AND statements definitely has an effect on the frequency of those intervals, here represented in both, absolute values and relative terms. Importantly, and I wanted to mention that previously, but this is probably a good time too, this flipping from charging to discharging or vice versa, that can also be informed by constrained SOC in the horizon, right? So even if an asset is doing that, while it's meeting the other two conditions, that is not a signal that the asset is not constrained by its state of charge. It could still be constrained just in a different point of the horizon. Is that or is that not, part of the SE's action? I think, that's part of the discussion we had previously. But what is a fact, is that that's part of how resources, not just storage, is operationalized in the market today. And the effects of that, as we've discussed in our prior meeting, can and does result in, capturing intervals where, there's higher prices, and it can also result in the opposite if these do not materialize, but it is a fact of how the market operates. So it is important to note that all of those conditions being AND conditions, and particularly the existence of a third condition in those triggers, results in a fairly low frequency of intervals that meet all of them. Another important point here is that, as you can see across all of the three units, sellback intervals are more common than buyback intervals. And this is by design of the examples. Since, as we've discussed, we are trying to focus on situations where strategic bidding might unduly inflate the BCR payments, sellbacks are particularly vulnerable to that. And that is because in a sellback scenario, the difference is between the bid today in the status quo. The difference is between the bid and the LMP, where an LMP could be, positive and fairly high in real time. The bid where the LMP in a charging interval could go down to, minus 150. The bid can go very, very high in real time. So we wanted to look at scenarios that had more sellback intervals because those are a bit more vulnerable to this strategic bidding concern, since it's easier for the resource to bid in a manner that actually maximizes that spread, right? A resource can't bid lower than minus 150, but it can bid higher than positive 150. It can bid fairly high. So this is by design that there's more sellback intervals. Okay, so the first set of graphs here, we are looking at the universe of data, right? We're looking at the 3 units with all approaches graphed, and then the total for those 3 units with all approaches graphed. First, I'd like to call your attention to the graph on the left, figure 1. This figure shows that despite the fact that we are applying the same logic across the different units, there are differentiated effects. As you can tell, for unit C, for example, there is barely any difference between the status quo and an approach that is focused only in the subset of intervals that meet all of the trigger conditions. For units A and B, the story is a bit different. There's a more substantial difference between the status quo and the approaches that use a subset, that impact a subset of intervals. And in general, the approaches that are impacting all intervals also have differentiated effects. With using the DEB and using the latest min-max methodology as the ones that yield shortfalls that are a bit higher than using the day-ahead LMP or the first min-max calculation that was put forth by stakeholders. Really, I would say that the takeaway here is that, as we all know, BCR is a very complex topic, and extrapolating or generalizing the impact of a given approach is complex because it is largely dependent on the context of a unit and what occurred throughout the day. So the general trend that going from the status quo to a modified calculation in some intervals to a modified calculation in all intervals reduces the shortfall. It holds, but the effects are quite differentiated across the units in these examples, as you can see. The next set of graphs are focusing only on the status quo and the approaches that are impacting a subset of intervals, meaning those intervals that meet all of the CSAT triggers. Here you can see that differentiated impact more clearly. You can also note that of the different approaches that have been put forth by stakeholders, using exclusively the day-ahead LMP would have been perhaps the scenario that minimizes the shortfall the most across the board, even if for unit C, for example, that difference is still pretty marginal. It's pretty small. In that sense, you can also see that the latest min-max methodology for a subset of intervals is relatively comparative to the approach of using the DEB, both in the total and across the units. This is not, because we checked, this is not just that the latest methodology is using the DEB. It is in functional. It's doing all of the min-max that we're seeing, but the total shortfall is relatively similar. And this is doing the same comparison, but using the approaches that that apply across all intervals with the same logic. Here, I think that the trend that I mentioned before of the dev and the min-max, the latest min-max approach being fairly similar, and the other two minimizing shortfall even further is more clear. I would also underscore, as I mentioned before, that these scenarios have been constructed so that the status quo bar is affected by strategic bidding. So this difference between the status quo value and the values in the other approaches are expected to be, a significant difference, because the status quo value has been unduly inflated by how bids were submitted. So this, is consistent with the theory of being able to use a modified calculation to minimize that strategic bidding impact. And it's also consistent with the fact that this latest min-max methodology put forth by stakeholders is not the most, let's say, punitive approach out there compared to, for example, just using the day-ahead LMP, which was the initial proposal that we had heard from stakeholders. So this, represents this latest approach does represent an improvement in the sense that it does not eliminate or modify surpluses, but it has the ability to minimize shortfalls when the bid would have resulted in a significantly higher shortfall. And a final kind of trend that I wanted to underscore in this slide, as you can tell, is that the difference between the status quo and the latest methodology and the DEB methodology, those differences, the trend is now not as similar than when applied only in a subset of intervals, right? Here you can see that even though in the totals, the values between the latest approach and using the DEB are, in the same ballpark, when you look at it by unit, there are differentiated impacts, right? For unit C in particular, the latest approach results in higher shortfalls than using the DEB, even though that is not the case for units A and B. And unit B in particular drives a lot of the results of the total here, simply because of the magnitude of the shortfall for unit B. This final slide with the graphs serves to compare the status quo to the two flavors of the latest min-max methodology, either applied in a subset of intervals or applied across all intervals. As you can see here, definitely the largest, let's say, change is for unit B, which, as I mentioned, is all of these examples have been constructed to have an impact coming from strategic bidding. So in this sense, this is, an important change for the results of unit B. For unit C, however, the modified calculation only in a subset of intervals does not yield that much of a difference, and that is mostly because if you even go back to the frequency table slide, a lot of intervals for unit C meet some of the conditions, but not all of those trigger conditions, even though that the bids in those given intervals could result in inflated BCR. So this, is trying to show, what would be the difference across these units and in total from the different approaches. You can see a trend, but as I mentioned before, BCR is quite complex and it's largely dependent on context too. Okay, let's pause there to see if there's any questions.
We have
You
one
have
question.
one question.
Hi, Sergio. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. Thank you for putting these charts together. They're helpful to visualize some of the impacts. Quick question, and I apologize if I missed it at the beginning of this section. What do you know? Is it just 3 units that you guys looked at to put this data together? And then how many days does this represent, or is this just 3 units on 3 different days?
That is a good question. So each example unit is a 24-hour example. So this is for each unit. It's a full day for each of the example units. Yeah.
Okay, so it's just representing 36 hours.
Yeah.
24
well,
hours.
Not
Okay,
36. Sorry.
Not
24
36
times
per
3,
unit.
72.
Oh, yes, sorry, too early for me. Okay, so this is just a couple examples highlighting the strategic bidding aspect of it. Okay, that's useful to know. Did you guys look kind of more comprehensively? Because obviously if you're proposing this to be implemented in every single interval for all resources, these numbers will drastically change. So have you guys, and I know it's a lot to ask and it's not easy to do this, have you guys thought about or maybe doing a larger sample set of this data?
So we constructed more examples. This, I think, were the ones that were, from my perspective, the most helpful to visualize the trends that we're seeing. And I would say the overall trends are, focusing on a subset of intervals leaves it largely to the fact whether an interval meets all conditions or not. Some of them might meet 2, but not the third one. It will still result in reductions in general, but will it result in reductions for all units? Not necessarily when you look at unit C. And focusing on, applying it to all intervals does reduce BCR coming from strategic bidding. Further, with the latest proposal being perhaps one of the least impactful compared to just using the day-ahead LMP. So, brief answer is yes, we developed even more examples than the ones we've included here. We've included these ones because they highlight that there's a differentiated, impact across the different units, even though they all have been designed to have that status quo value influenced by strategic bidding. But what we've seen on the other examples is that this trend generally holds. If there is, appetite or questions about, having other data, that's something that we can assess and would love to see that in your comments. I'd say generally, this trend that you see in the totals, roughly holds. You would just see that in different example units, the bars will be, relatively different to each other, mostly based on how those trigger intervals would work. Yeah.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. Yeah, I think looking at a more holistic or a larger sample set would be extremely useful just because we're looking at the relative impact of different variations here instead of narrowing in on a couple examples. I see the usefulness of highlighting these, but if we're looking at kind of the overall impact, I think having data to support that would be extremely useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Sergio. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes, Kathleen.
Excellent. So I have sort of a comment and a question, I believe, but I've tried to look through the slides and I don't see anything about the further track. And the reason I'm going to bring this up one more time is that everything that Callie is raising, and Don, but both of them, like it's incredibly important to not adopt an overly punitive approach for all intervals if this is going to be in effect for an extended period of time. I keep coming back to, I really need more context on what the commitment is to have the new uplift framework. Because a part of this overarching context of the discussion is, over the last several months of working on this issue together, I think there is a consensus that we need to move forward. Yeah, thank you for moving. And so more, that has to be what we get clarity on. How long are we talking about having this in effect?
Yeah, so I moved further, spoilers for everyone else, but in slide 32, we do talk about, how we'll commence this work to holistically redesign Uplift in consideration of other issues that, impact BCR, such as the depth formulation, the nonlinearity of performance, the impacts of outages, bit parameters, and mitigation related to BCR. I think kind of going back to a comment that Callie had made in prior meetings, it is pretty complex to be able to do robust redesign work on an immediate deadline, right? So we definitely want to immediately start this work, but we want to be able to work through it in detail with collaboration with stakeholders, and that we all work together, putting our thinking caps on to come up with a good uplift mechanism that we are comfortable represents the complexities of storage accurately. So in that sense, we're not thinking about, at this time, we're not thinking about having a specific sunset date with this interim solution. More so, what we want to do is, have it in place and then immediately start working on the redesign of Uplift for storage. So, I know that doesn't give you a date right now, but I think that the fact that it doesn't give you a date is really because we don't want to rush the development of a new uplift mechanism. We do have to act quickly on closing the strategic bid and concern, because since we started talking about this issue, because we want buy-in and collaboration from stakeholders, we had to be very explicit about how this design gap works and how it could be, adversely used. So for that, we need to definitely move quickly, and that's why compromises and, modifications to the proposals have been made. For the next stage, we want to have the time to collaborate with you all and to work on these deeply important issues. And we don't really think that at this time that a sunset day would be conducive to that. Does this help, Kathleen? Yeah.
Yeah, and in the spirit of compromise, which is how I'm approaching this conversation, I'm trying to find pathways to help you get to the destination you're striving towards. So I've heard what you've said about the sunset date, and I understand that putting something in the tariff has a heavier weight. But that's different than giving us an indication of what a future tracks timeline and potential implementation might look like. And the reason I'm pushing back just slightly, Sergio, is that I know you do have some line of sight to what your implementation bandwidth is for the next few releases. We have some very big releases on the table, DAME and EDAM, and some other kind of more auxiliary efforts are being pushed in 2025, 26. So it's very practical to me to have an ask of the CAISO team to provide the detail of, we have bandwidth for an uplift implementation in 25 or you don't, 26 or you don't, 2027 at the earliest. I know the team has that sense, and that's important data that we need you to provide to us. Does that ask make sense for you to put in the next iteration what the earliest implementation feasibility is?
I would say, you know, that part of understanding the ability to implement in the different timelines is very much dependent on the design of a new uplift approach. And at this time, you know, it would be easier if I were to say, well, I imagine that our new uplift approach will be basically based on what's our proposed solution in the issue paper and straw proposal. So imagining that, it could be in this given timeline. But we don't want to presuppose that. We want to actively stakeholder that, because we are aware of the sensitivities and complexities of BCR. That has been made evidence by this initiative, for sure. So, well, you know, I definitely take to heart your comment, and we'll think about what kind of, you know, further indication we can share. But I would not want to presuppose a solution to give you an answer so that, you know, we can actively work with stakeholders on this matter, since, you know, this whole conversation has been very clear that there's a lot of voices, a lot of perspectives, and if we have the chance to redo Uplift from the ground up, we want that to enrich the conversation. But I hear you, and we'll think how to think about it. Thank you, Kathleen. Yeah.
For sake of timing, I just want to keep us tight so you can move on to the next person. So the last time this came up, when you indicated the all intervals, what district communicated at the time was it would require a leadership level commitment to develop the holistic approach, and if I hadn't indicated, and an indicator of timing. And the reason that this is so important is that we might be able to make this compromise you're asking us if your leadership team commits to replacing it within a certain timeline. Without that kind of commitment, all the concerns that I'm hearing from WPTF become much, much more important to us. So for a glide path, please do take that back and push harder. The second suggestion that I have for you to also hopefully help you on a glide path is I would highly encourage the CAISO to think of a mechanism in their proposal that would allow for a scheduling coordinator to come to you and seek relief for losses that they've incurred even under this modified approach. The data you've shown show that some days could be very outsized, some days may be pretty balanced, but regardless, what we see as an SC is, especially on days where we're mitigated, that the result of the market the market results do result in pushing losses or exposures of any kind of cost risk onto us. And so in the instance where we observe a credible loss, we need a mechanism to come and seek a dispute, essentially, of some kind. The problem with calling it a dispute is, as most know, the response is going to be it's functioning as designed, and then the dispute will be declined. That could go into an alternative dispute resolution process. But if if you actually design an approach or a mechanism, some kind of process to address the issues where there's mitigation or where the market itself is resulting in a suboptimal outcome, then that could be used on a minimal basis in extreme circumstances to make us whole when it is truly warranted on an after-the-fact review process. So if that's something you can add to this proposal, that might also help us be able to reach that compromise you're asking for.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the feedback, Kathleen. We'll definitely take that to heart and think about it, and we'll welcome that in your written feedback as well. Thank you. I see Alva's hand is up as well.
Hey, Sergio, I just wanted to join that conversation with the points that Kathleen was bringing up. I think you presented really well in the paper that there are some strongly conflicting positions on this. And in my mind, you can't promise a solution at the point where you don't have a consensus on sort of the grounding of that solution. So in my mind, there's a CAISO is committed to progressing on this issue, but I think the initial phase of that is going to be more of a discussion or a presentation of principles, because the perspectives taken by the public advocate and DMM are quite different from anything we're presenting, what I'm presenting, or let alone what others who are more on the merchant side are presenting. So I think it's really necessary to get a more commonality there. And then you go to a sort of this is what the solution should look like. And you don't want that actual development work to conflict with the DAME and EDAM work. In my mind, that's the highest priority for anything that is going to require development work. And I think what you've listed here requires development work, is that it be bracketed in such a way that it does not impact the go live on DAME and EDAM. I think beyond that point, that development work can you can lay the groundwork, you can prepare, you can even essentially design what you think this ideal solution would look like. But I think it's hard to commit to a delivery date, because then once you start on development, you actually know how difficult that becomes. So I think as long as the CAISO is committing to a process that's going on during this period, that's the best we can really hope for, given the number of different interests that are involved in this. I don't think, unfortunately, this is not just a question of addressing and I think Kathleen's idea of having an approach for redress is a good way to try to make sure that storage operators don't feel that they're going to be left out in the cold. But I think it has to be done in a way that addresses some of those other concerns, which I don't even necessarily agree with, but I think we need to understand more clearly why DMM and Public Advocate have taken such a strong position on why they think what they think the ideal solution is. So, thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Al. I think you put it quite succinctly, and it is true, like when we start thinking about a redesign of Uplift, we'll need to tackle the fact that different stakeholders, different perspectives are coming at this issue from different sides, and that we'll need to first, agree on some of the principles, and that will give us a bit more of a line of sight into what the policy would look like, what the development would look like. We don't want to presuppose that we want to be, taking all stakeholders on that ride and working on it together. So I appreciate that comment. I don't see any other hands at this time. I'll go back to the slide I left off then. Okay. So after reviewing all of these examples, we've thought that applying this modified BCR calculation across all intervals to eliminate the opportunity for strategic bidding to inflate VCR payments ensures that storage resources will be made whole to a reasonable proxy of their costs, and that is a viable interim solution. The examples that we just saw illustrate, as I mentioned, that the different approaches result in differentiated outcomes per unit. This is driven by several variables, but perhaps the most impactful one is the number of intervals that meet all of the trigger conditions that were included in the analysis. The frequency of such intervals is largely determined by the fact that these are and, statements cumulative to be able to flag the interval. For some units, this results in, a low share of intervals actually triggering the alternative calculation, despite the fact that they might meet one or two of the three conditions. In this context, and considering that, considering that what happens in the binding interval is not purely determined by the characteristics of that given interval, applying the modified calculation across all intervals is necessary to fully eliminate that possibility of strategic bidding. The extension of the existing construct to storage resources has evidently resulted in complexity, complications, and unintended outcomes. And the need for that redesign should not delay the efforts to address the current gap for strategic bidding behavior, since it materially exposes ratepayers to adverse consequences. So in this context, a modified formula that takes into account all of the other cost proxies presents a measured approach to ensure that bidding behavior does not result even inadvertently in unduly inflated VCR calculations. And we know, that from our conversation so far, that we think that there is, there is precedent to such action in our market, and that there is precedent at FERC as well to consider that the current formula that it only uses the real-time bid does so despite the fact that those bids have been found to not only express marginal costs, but also opportunity cost, economic unwillingness or willingness to dispatch, the actual commodity of the issue, which the asset, which is the state of charge. So from our perspective, applying this modified VCR calculation across all intervals will eliminate that opportunity to bid strategically, and it's a viable compromise too. And from our point of view, this is desirable really for three key reasons. The first one is that it's feasible to develop in the near term and to resettle as needed, thus curing the current design gap as soon as possible. This is essential because since we started this initiative, we have, essentially provided a playbook on how this gap could be utilized, and we need to close this gap as soon as possible in the interest of load, other market participants, and ratepayers. The second reason is that since VCR calculates shortfalls and surpluses for each interval, applying this modified calculation across all intervals is the only means to effectively eliminate the ability of resources to bid strategically. This is mainly because, as I've mentioned several times now, the actions of a given resource are not just impacting that specific interval, nor are the instructions or outcomes of a given interval only determined by that interval alone. Advisory, the past and the future intervals are all, coming in play here. And finally, we find that this is a measured approach to solve the concerns described in the paper and in this initiative as a whole, while allowing us to move ahead to the development of a new uplift mechanism for storage as soon as possible. I think I've seen Don's hand go up and down a couple of times, but now it stayed up. So I'll pause here to see if there's a question there before moving forward.
So this is Don Treadway from CSEP. I just want to make a comment. I think you're using the term strategically bidding and way overstating it. The example that I gave earlier in this meeting, where I don't have a day ahead schedule, and I put my bids in to charge and discharge, and in the binding interval, I'm held out of merit because the advisory interval says that you can cover my spread between my charge and discharge bids. That is not strategic bidding. And the fact that the CAISO forecast changes when the advisory interval becomes binding, and what made the decision for me to be dispatched out of merit does not materialize, and I receive BCR, that's not strategic. There's no strategic bidding there. The market, I didn't force the optimization to do something that increased the amount of BCR payments I received. The market optimization made the decision based on the bids I provided. The market, so I didn't force the optimization to make any decision. So that's not strategic.
Yeah, I think in that context, in that given example, as we've discussed prior, part of the presumption too, or assumption there as well, is that what is happening in a given interval is influenced by the advisory intervals. And that, as you mentioned, is not something that is happening through the action of the SV, but it is impacted by the fact that the resource, first of all, is energy limited, kind of by definition. That is important because if the resource was not energy limited, MIO wouldn't dispatch it uneconomically to capture, a different opportunity in future intervals. It would not need to do that calculation. But once more, I will restate that we are not eliminating BCR. We are not making energy ineligible for BCR. We are not making intervals ineligible for BCR. In those contexts, BCR will be calculated, and if at the net, at the end of the day, there is a shortfall, it will be paid out. The only modification we're doing here once more is what is that cost proxy.
I understand that, Sergio, but the problem is in my scenario that I'm bringing to you, the correct cost to use for BCR is the real-time bid. Because if the CAISO was right, I would have a shortfall based on my real-time bid and a surplus when the binding advisory interval became binding, and they would net to zero. But now you're going to use a different number than what was used by the optimization to basically make that advisory dispatch based on the spread.
Yeah, and if we applied this to a subset of intervals, we would also use different numbers in different intervals, and it would also have an effect on the shortfall and surplus net at the end of the day.
Right, but that's only an instance, right? But that's in intervals where the opportunity for strategic bidding can actually occur when you have the day ahead schedule and you know you have a day ahead schedule.
That is your characterization of those intervals. From our perspective, that those are not the sole intervals where the opportunity for strategic bidding can occur. So I will, I welcome the comments. I appreciate the feedback. Love to see that in the written feedback as well for our consideration. But I think there is a difference in the representation of which intervals have that opportunity between how you are formulating that concern and how we are seeing it in the examples and in what we're seeing in the markets.
Then my last comment is I would highly recommend that the CAISO do some analysis to identify instances where the third condition is triggered or would be triggered, which is if you had a schedule to discharge and then you were completely flipped to a charge schedule. I think it would be very, very interesting to do some research to figure out how that's actually occurring, because that that to me is demonstration that the optimization is making the decision to how it's going to operate that resource, and it's not simply the fact that the SOC couldn't support the day ahead schedule. So it'd be really understanding what's actually creating, what is the driver of that situation where the third criteria kicks in, because that I think will go a long ways to understanding what we need to do from a long-term solution.
Yeah, thank you for the feedback, Don. We'll consider that as well. I see a couple of hands up, Michaela and Paul.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Michaela Flag, Customized Energy Solutions. So I was hoping to just get a confirmation. At the last meeting in the DMM's presentation, I took away that strategic bidding wasn't like leading to large amounts of BCR, or wasn't the largest factor. I'm trying to remember. It seemed as though it was just negative revenues were contributing most to BCR and not bid behavior. Is that true?
I would prefer not to speak on behalf of DMM regarding their analysis. They can, confirm that. From our perspective, the need to close out the gap on strategic bidding is largely driven by the fact that we now have very explicitly stated how it could be done. And we did so because we wanted to address these issues with the collaboration and with the consideration of stakeholder perspectives. Now that we've done so, regardless of what historical analysis might state, it is a fact that the gap is now well known and that we need to close it as soon as possible in the interest of load, other market participants, and ratepayers. So that's what I would address there. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Let's take Paul's question. Oh, I think he lowered his hand. Never mind. Okay, Paul's back. Let's go take his question.
Office. I do just want to emphasize that Cal Advocates does strongly support.
Sorry, Paul, could you state your affiliation too?
Yeah,
Sorry.
Paul Warhatch from the
call.
Yes, Paul Warhatch from the Public Advocates Office at the CPUC.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. I just want to emphasize that Cal Advocates, it does strongly support a comprehensive, holistic solution. Our concern all along is in the interim that it shouldn't be ratepayers that bear the brunt of unwarranted BCR and the punitive BCR payments falling on ratepayers, and that's been the principle that's driving our position. I think we're prepared to in the spirit of compromise for the interim solution move to a position of support with some reservations. I think the point just made about strategic versus unwarranted BCR. Historically, we still have concern that there'll be residual BCR that's going to fall on ratepayers. I do want to make the point that in moving to a holistic solution, I think an underlying principle should remain that state of charge driven BCR that leads to non-performance should be ineligible. So I want to make sure that as we move forward that as other parties begin to push back on that, it remains kind of core to what we're trying to achieve. So, thanks.
Thank you for that, Paul. I really appreciate your comments, and we are, continuously committed to working on this uplift matter, and we'll, as we said prior, we'll have to start with a consideration and statements of principle. So it's great that you're getting us there already. Let's go with Catherine and Adam.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm Catherine Stockton. I work for the Public Utilities Commission in the Energy Division. And so I'm not the lead on this case, but I just wanted to generally comment, that I really appreciate that CAISO is working on this issue. This is an issue where, you see a gap where, ratepayers could be charged for unnecessary costs. And I just want to, encourage you to continue forward. And I just generally want to comment that I've been really surprised by the tone that stakeholders have taken with CAISO. We, from my perspective, and I'm just speaking for myself here, not for my organization, from my perspective, and, I see Public Advocate's Office, we, advocate on behalf of making sure that prices aren't unnecessarily increased. We have strong reservations about things like scarcity pricing. And consensus is, never something that is required for CAISO to take action. So I think that it's a great thing that you're doing to close a gap, thinking about it like taxpayer loopholes for the rich, right? Like if if there are loopholes, they will be exploited, and it doesn't, reflect on anyone's character. So I just encourage stakeholders to be respectful to CAISO, and thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Really appreciate it. Adam?
Yeah, hi, Sergio. I just wanted to respond to Michaela's comment earlier to confirm the interpretation of DMM's presentation in the last meeting, which is just to say that, yeah, I think the data that we've looked at suggests that the majority of storage BCR that's been paid out in real time, at least over 2024, through the period that Roger presented on, does appear to be largely a result of the revenue side of the BCR calculation rather than the big cost side. So I think what that suggests is that most of the cases we're seeing are cases of buybacks of day-ahead discharge schedules rather than sellbacks of charging schedules. But anyway, yeah, that was left as a question, and just wanted to confirm Michaela's interpretation. Thanks.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, I don't think we have, I don't think we have other hands up right now. So I will keep going. If I see other questions, I'll pause again, but probably won't pause until we finish this section here. I think there's only a couple slides left. So yeah, we've talked about the reasoning behind applying this calculation across the board. Why we think the three reasons that make this modification desirable and viable. I also wanted to touch upon some of the questions that we've heard from from stakeholders regarding the applicability of this modified formulations for resources outside of the CAISO BAA. At this time, both the ISO and I think from reviewing the positions of different stakeholders, we currently favor that near-term modifications treat WEIM only and CAISO EDAM resources equally. In this context, we are thinking of using these modified calculations for those assets as well. And for those assets where the day-ahead LMP term might be used, we would use a null value for those WEIM only assets. We appreciate the discussion regarding this matter in the comments and in the prior iterations of this initiative, and we welcome consideration of these questions in the future work regarding uplift redesign. And at this time, as I mentioned, we're favoring equal treatment application with that asterisk of the day-ahead LMP term, and we'll look forward to your feedback or thoughts on this in written comments, as well as discussion of the matter when we move to a more complete redesign of uplift. So just as we were talking about before with some of the questions from Kathleen, we want to underscore that moving forward with this near-term interim solution will greatly allow us to focus our efforts immediately on a holistic redesign of storage uplift. We want to reiterate that commitment and note that if this present interim solution is approved by the Board of Governors and WEM governing body, we'll commence an initiative to holistically think about the uplift redesign for storage assets in a way that considers modifications to the debt formulation, the nonlinearity of storage performance, which is a very important characteristic of the asset class, and the evaluation of how outages, bit parameters, and mitigation relate to BCR and uplift more generally. That is the end of this section. I'll pause here because I see another hand up, and then we can talk about mitigation.
Let's go ahead and unmute Don.
Thanks. Don Trethewey from CISA. So my anticipation and hope was that once we completed this interim solution to address the issues with the unwarranted and inflated BCR, that we would move to a more broader initiative than just focusing on bid cost recovery for storage, but rather move to the energy storage enhancements initiative, because the key is we need to identify improvements to the modeling of storage, the bidding flexibility of storage to better reflect the real-time prices. And once we've done that, we can look to see where is it appropriate for BCR to still be paid to storage resources once we've addressed the current limitations that are reasons why you would want to maintain BCR for storage. So
yes, Don. Thank you for the comments. I agree with that perspective. This language does not mean to exclude other topics of conversation or for the future initiative that should look comprehensively at storage. What I'm merely trying to state here in this series of bullets these are definitely elements that will need to be included, paid attention to when we think about a redesign of uplift, because they materially affect how we would develop an uplift mechanism. But I agree with you that we should not preclude or a conversation or the evaluation of other elements that affect storage resources. We want to be able to, in that future effort, we want to be able to work with stakeholders to prioritize and organize issues in a manner that is logical, that makes sense, that allows us to move forward and have material outcomes in the different steps of the way. So this is not intended to limit the scope. It's just intended to highlight what we will definitely need to talk about when we talk about BCR in that effort. So I appreciate the comment, Don, and we'll keep that in mind. Thank you. Okay, I don't see any other hands at this point, and we made it, I think, with 5 minutes to spare. So that's great. Let's move on to talk a little bit about mitigation, and then we'll have another opportunity for questions and open discussion. Okay, so throughout this initiative, different stakeholders have noted that mitigation is a specific instance that may require okay, I just saw another hand, so maybe before we go into this, we can address that. Callie?
Yeah, hey, Sergio, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I was having technical issues and the little hand button wouldn't let me press it. Just real quick, so I appreciate you saying this isn't like to narrow the scope of kind of the next phase of this effort, but I did also want to highlight it would be useful to have at least some assurance as to which policy effort the storage, not just the storage DEB, but then also how that leads into the ability for storage resources to use the reference level adjustment process. And the reason I'm raising that here is because in the price formations enhancements call that was, I think, a week ago, they actually pointed to this effort to continue that conversation, even though it started over there. So I just want to make sure that's not lost anywhere. So if there's any way you guys can maybe, when you issue the next iteration of this paper, specify, yes, we are going to continue that conversation and its home is in this effort. So we keep track of where that conversation will happen.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the feedback, Callie. That's always good to have clarity on that kind of where everything has its home. So we'll do that. Thank you.
Yeah, because it was originally raised in price formations and they kind of kicked it over to you guys. So we just want to make sure that's not lost. Thanks.
Makes sense. Thank you. I don't see another hand. So now let's go to mitigation for real this time. So as I was talking about before, stakeholders had noted throughout this process that instances where a resource is mitigated in intervals prior to what would be a buyer sellback may merit specific VCR provisions. This was echoed by the MSC in a prior meeting, noting that depending how material this concern is, the ISO should consider applying something like what we do for the hold exceptional dispatch to calculate the VCR for dispatch due to mitigation that reduced resources revenues over the day, or that impacted the resource's ability to perform to its awards and schedules later on. Since then, there's been quite the analysis and discussion on the matter. In our prior stakeholder meeting, the MM presented metrics that indicated that in general, mitigation has had minimal impact on battery dispatch, and that when material, it had the greatest impact in the 3 peak net load hours from hour ending 19 to 21, so from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. As such, mitigation is unlikely to have affected the state of charge of resources in a manner that would have compromised their ability to meet awards and schedules, thus, unlikely to have an impact on ultimately buy and sellbacks of these schedules. So, since the analysis that we have talked about before and that had been presented prior was historical, the MM also conducted additional analysis to estimate the impact of mitigation under a circumstance where the ISO has, let's say, eliminated VCR for assets buying and selling back their schedules. They constructed this analysis using the same data, but assumed that all batteries were bidding at $1,000 per megawatt hour during all hours, and that all batteries had chosen the storage DEB option. Those are, important assumptions to give us a sense not only of like the historical impact of mitigation, but the potential future impact of it. So that additional analysis showed that even if batteries were bidding at $1,000 in every hour, mitigation would have likely had a minimal impact on dispatch prior to the peak net load hours on critical days. Those were the subset of days that they were looking at. And that's important because it would entail that mitigation would have unlikely had, a material impact on if and their head awards and schedules were being bought or sold back. So in this context, DMM noted that they did not believe that mitigation has or could have played a significant role in impacting that ability of supporting the end schedules, and that, changes to the VCR rules should not be deferred or delayed until enhancements related to mitigation, such as in improving the DEV, are made. They did note, however, that while the current and future impact of mitigation on its ability to meet day-ahead schedule appears minimal, some loss remains possible, and that the ISO should continue to consider a settlement provision targeting the prevented revenue losses in this situation. I want to underscore that this specific comment also, is in the context of the ISO moving forward with something like the initially proposed solution that was making energy ineligible for VCR, right? But it's important to note that, what we're talking about, what we've been talking about today, there would continue to be VCR, and it would only change the cost proxy, right? But we wanted to keep, to better understand, the potential impacts of mitigation. So the ISO conducted further analysis. This is included in the draft final proposal, and since it's, a material addition, we wanted to go over it here. This further analysis is trying to understand the amount of state of charge depletion associated with mitigated dispatch in the 5-minute market and the actual megawatt amount of day-ahead buy and sell back in the 5-minute market. We focused on the 5-minute markets because those mitigation impacts, that mitigation impacts the state of charge, and in turn, it impacts the 5-minute dispatch later in the day. It's also important because this type of mitigation in the real-time dispatch in the 5-minute market can have an impact for VCR for the revenue side in both the 15 and 5-minute markets. Since the 15-minute market results are financially binding, but only operationally advisory, it's really the 5-minute schedules that have direct implication on future hours. So this is how the analysis was done. We're really looking at two variables here: the percentage impact of 5-minute or RTD mitigation on VCR, and the VCR impact on the asset. We, as you can see, we're looking at incremental or extra megawatts dispatched in the 5-minute market in the hours preceding, the afternoon, the evening, from noon to 5 p.m. And then we are looking at that percentage impact by dividing that over how many megawatts they were short in the peak hours. So this considers that like temporal effect that could happen from mitigation. So importantly, that extra or incremental megawatt dispatch here is estimated as the difference between the original market dispatch and a counterfactual with the original resource bids. So basically the difference between what happened when you were mitigated and what would have happened if there was no mitigation. The counterfactual dispatch is calculated using the existing bids to determine what would have been optimal under the original prices. So we're not modifying the bids there. And for simplicity, this counterfactual dispatch does not consider the impact on SOC binding conditions. So, this is still largely capturing the issue that we've heard from stakeholders as well, that what if we're mitigated prior to when we have a schedule or award? How material is that concern? That's what we're trying to assess. So the ISO's analysis, and this is explained in a bit more detail too in the paper. Here are the highlights. The ISO's analysis found that the impact of mitigation in the 5-minute market by by volume is relatively small, 3% annually and up to 6.6% in the month with the highest impact. This also shows that the overall distribution of that percentage impact at the system level is pretty low with some limited outliers. There are some assets out there where that impact is a bit higher. The analysis, it also indicates that the portion of real-time BCR that was impacted by mitigation was relatively low compared to the total BCR paid to storage assets. According to this analysis, less than a quarter of the days, of the resource days, were impacted by mitigation, and only 8 resource days had a BCR impact of $10,000 or more, meaning that, you know, for the remainder of that quarter, of that 25%, there was some impact of mitigation, but it's way lower than 10,000. So, you know, having an impact essentially means having a non-zero value, but it's really just a limited number of outliers that have a very material impact, as we're seeing here. So I've included a couple of figures here to illustrate that daily percentage impact, the impact of 5-minute mitigation on dispatch volume. It's a bit hard to see all of the points, right, because they overlap with each other. So I'd welcome you to first look at the box and the whiskers of the box. At least that's how I call them. I don't know if that's that common, but if you see that, you'll see that the bulk of the assets really are well below the 20% impact in terms of resource days, and there's a very limited number of outliers that fall above the 40% threshold. It's about 6 of them that fall above that threshold, while the vast majority are below and really trending towards less than 10%. This figure is similarly, trying to show that relative impact of mitigation on the real-time BCR. The total of the columns represent the total real-time BCR that was paid out by month. In cyan, you have like all the different sources of BCR, and in pink, we have the mitigation impact. You can see that mitigation impact, is quite modest across the board, and mainly, in a couple of months, it's a little bit more pronounced than others, but overall, it's generally small. In this context, the ISO's analysis, reaches similar conclusions as the MM. That is that the impact of mitigation remains minimal on affecting the state of charge in a manner that would jeopardize the asset's ability to meet their day-ahead schedules. And in this context, it is apparent that the current and future impact should not delay or complicate the implementation of a near-term solution focused on closing the gap related to strategic bidding that would unduly inflate VCR payments. While there are outliers out there because of this fact, we agree that consideration of specific exceptions or for instances of mitigation may be warranted as part of a holistic redesign of uplift. But since the draft final proposal, what we're trying to move ahead with, does not disallow VCR or makes intervals or energy ineligible for VCR, we believe that solution will continue to capture and be able to make whole resources to a reasonable proxy of cost. As we keep discussing new uplift mechanisms, we'll keep the impact of mitigation in mind and how to address that if specific provisions are necessary. but it seems largely at this point that it should not delay or complicate our action. That is the last slide on mitigation. I'll pause here to see if there's any questions. I see one already. Yeah.
Sergio, this is Mike McGuffin from CES. On the analysis of the mitigation impact, were you just looking at cases where there was mitigation and there was bid cost recovery, or were you looking at the individual cost of those specific intervals? Or were you looking at the whole day or just those specific intervals as it related to other future intervals?
Yes, I believe that this was looking at the whole day. Let me see if there's a colleague of mine on the line to confirm that. I am fairly sure about that, but let me check for a moment.
Okay, I think if you're looking at the entire daily impact, that's really going to mute a lot of the problem, because it all falls out in the wash, right? You get some losses in 1 hour, you get gains in another, but this is harm to these storage resources when this happens. And I can point to an example 2 days ago where a frequently mitigated storage resource was unable to charge, was depleted throughout the solar hours, was unable to meet 2 hours of an energy discharge and one spin, and prices spiked to over $2,000 and cost the unit close to $30,000 in 2 hours because of this specific issue. And so, I think it doesn't happen to most resources. I'll acknowledge that, but the ones that it does, it's very harmful. So I think putting off a solution to the next stakeholder iteration will just cause these units more harm. And I don't know, how to manage a unit that is in this state where they're consistently mitigated, unable to meet day-ahead obligations, or just cycled in a way that loses them money. There has to be something done to protect those resources, because days like 2 days ago will bankrupt these projects.
I would just say, Mike, that we would have to review and better examine whatever the cases you're referring to before, opining specifically on them. But I would note that what we are pursuing in this effort in the near term does not eliminate the VCR or disallow it or make it ineligible. It would only modify the cost proxy. This resource would still get VCR. That's where I'm going. It will get that. What we're saying here is that the solution that we are putting forth should not be delayed for having for constructing a different way of calculating BCR over what we already have. But it would still calculate a shortfall, if any, and it would still be included in the net over the whole day and paid to the resource. I just want to make that very, very clear. Yeah.
I understand that, but the bid cost recovery is just a muted value for storage for when you look at it over a day, because you often have to submit pricing that is well out, well in the money to ensure that you're picked up, and not just leave things to the market and end up missing a schedule because you were trying to be too cute with your bid price. So I'll reiterate, there needs to be some mechanism for these frequently mitigated resources. And I don't know if these resources, it doesn't sound like DMM is willing to, turn off the mitigation of the charging bid segment. But I mean, I think that's a solution in the interim. And I would honestly, I think bid cost recovery in general for storage, most of what we've seen is due to some of the issues that we discussed, whether it's the ASSOC constraint, the forced buybacks, mitigation. So you could turn off bid cost recovery. I know some people might disagree with that, but if you turn it off for the interim period, get rid of the mitigation of storage for the interim period, and come up with a holistic solution, instead of trying to come up with a new calculation that sits on top of the other calculations that have been put into place incorrectly over the last year. And we're still in the process of resettling those and trying to correct the last implementation of bid cost recovery changes. So, and that's, I guess that leads into my next question is what is the ISO going to do to ensure that the calculation is correct going into this and not layering on more logic on existing incorrect logic that will then have to be resettled again, in the future?
When you say to make sure that the calculation is correct, you mean the BCR calculation, the cost calculation? Could you be
yeah, so the ASSOC constraint was initially implemented wrong. Back in July of 2023, it was revised and modified subsequent, and was, again, the logic is incorrect in terms of the way the ASSOC constraint flag is generated. It overly claws back bid cost recovery that shouldn't. Basically, all bid cost recovery for the most part is clawed back based on the use of incorrectly generated flags. So it's
I better understand the question now. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Mike. That helped me understand the question a bit more. I would say a couple of things. First, we always obviously strive to implement to the spirit of the policy, to what we've discussed. And obviously, this is a complex issue that results sometimes in having to revisit, rethink how we are looking at a particular new feature or implementation. So we are, committed to doing that and to work on it. I would say that this actually kind of illustrates a bit more too why, from our perspective, applying the modified BCR calculations across all intervals is a desirable solution and a superior solution. And it is because it allows for a much more cleaner implementation that is, easier to enact and to move forward with. An important difficulty of other prior efforts as well was, as you said, the development of these different flags and for different intervals under different conditions. And that always adds significant complexity when, developing the solution. So in a sense, this concern that you are underscoring, I think is definitely part of why we believe that moving forward with a modified calculation across all intervals is desirable and viable, right? It will allow us to minimize any of the risks related to the development of these flags and to the identification of different subsets of intervals and when to do X or Y. It will really, make it so that implementation is much ideally much more smoother, right? So we understand the frustration. We are committed, to minimize that and to work on it and to ensure that the tools and policies are implemented to the spirit of what's been discussed with stakeholders and agreed upon. And we think that underscores why a a solution like the one we're trying to push forward here is this arrow. So hopefully that gets a bit to your comment, Mike, and I appreciate it, and we'll love to see your feedback in written comments too as well.
Thank you, Sergio.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, I don't see any other hands at this time. I will say a couple of quick things before I pass it on to Brenda. So the first one is, as I noted previously, we think that there might be an opportunity for a couple of lines of clarification on that section 7 of the draft final proposal. So we'll update that language and get it posted as soon as possible so that you all can consider that for your written comments. And we will also be posting that written comment template later today as well, so that you can submit your comments on the 21st, and we'll be very grateful for your feedback and your perspective, so that we can move forward on this efforts and go to the board and governing body in less than a month now. For now, this is the last stakeholder call that is scheduled. I think we'll stick to that, and without, I don't want to jinx it, but if there's more conversation needed, we'll also think about that. I'd just like to, thank you all for your collaboration and engagement. I know there's been a very complex topic in a very, challenging timeline as well. And I appreciate your efforts and your feedback and your collaboration, and we look forward to continue, working with you in the future iterations of this matter. So thank you all, and with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Brenda Marquez.
Thank you, Sergio. So as Sergio just mentioned, we will be uploading a new revised draft final proposal, and also providing that comment template. I'll send a daily briefing maybe today or tomorrow to announce when we do that. So that way folks that weren't on the call are able to see that. And also we will be providing any information if something does come up through the ISO daily briefing. So that October 21st still stands for the comments due on the draft final proposal. We also sent out that link. We did update that presentation that's available here on the website. Any questions, feel free to send them over to myself or at the ISO stakeholder affairs at kaiso.com. And lastly, we do have a new energy blog matters for this upcoming stakeholder symposium featuring my VP, Joanne Serena. She did highlight a lot of great aspects about the upcoming stakeholder symposium. For most of you who will be joining us this year, we're excited to kick things off with the welcome reception at the Kempton Sawyer, as well as the upcoming stakeholder program on October 30th. So check out that blog if you'd like to learn more about the upcoming symposium. As well, the KAISO website does feature helpful links to direct you to register, and we will also be live streaming this event. So we will be able to have that link available on the day of that event. And then lastly, just a recap of the stakeholder symposium. We have that coming up. And so we look forward to everyone participating. And if any questions, feel free to send an email to symposiumreg@kaiso.com. I'll be monitoring those questions, but most of all, we're really excited for everyone to join us this event that is one of our largest ones this year. At this time, I'll pass it to my event producer to conclude our call. Thank you so much.
This event has concluded. Thank you for using Intelligent Services. You may now disconnect.